Good Monday morning, everyone. Today is January 20th, 2020, and here's our very first Monday morning minute of the semester. So today we'll talk about last week's readings. We'll then briefly switch to previewing this week's readings, and then I'll talk about our very first assignment, our critical response number 1. So I realized in my long-ish video that was supposed to be kind of brief last week, it was about 20 minutes, that I didn't mention that we actually had a couple of chapters assigned. So if you looked at our learning modules in Blackboard, you would have seen that these chapters were assigned. I failed to mention them verbally, so if you didn't do them, no worries, just go back and look at them this week. They're the first 2 chapters in our Jones & Jones textbook, and they're important because they are foundational to the rest of the class, especially as we're considering this larger question of what is classroom management. So in general, thinking back to those readings, we learned that in the minds of our authors, classroom management isn't as much about compliance as it is about garnering cooperation among students. They take sort of a needs-based approach and looking at psychological development of young people in laying out their vision for classroom management. So in chapter 1, we learned, for instance, that 4 out of 5 disruptive students can be traced to either school dysfunction or teacher dysfunction, 4 out of 5. And I think this is important because it really dispels the myth that kids are inherently bad and are just doing things to annoy us, right? Oftentimes, 80% of the time, in fact, we can look at ourselves, we can look at our school to see the reasons why students are misbehaving. They also outline 5 principles of classroom management. These are shared on pages 8 and 9 and then detailed throughout the rest of the chapter. And I just want you to look at those and notice that these really aren't about disciplining students, which is what some people might think of when they hear classroom management, right? Like how to discipline students effectively. And that's really not what it's about. It's about relationships. It's about looking to research to help guide our work. It's about ensuring that we respond effectively anytime there are those misbehaviors, of course. And they also lay out this vision of a teacher researcher. So the idea here is not only that we as teachers should be sort of on top of research and again use research to guide our practice in class, but that we can also research our own classrooms. When there is an issue, we can take an inquiry-based approach and ask why this might be happening. Again, remembering that 4 out of 5 disruptions are due to either the classroom dysfunction or school dysfunction. So moving on to chapter 2, here's where the psychological needs approach really comes into focus. So here, Jones & Jones lay out personal needs theories, and they kind of go through a couple here. But the basic thesis here is that students misbehave when their needs are not being met. And I think that's such a helpful frame of mind to adopt as we think about classroom management. Again, going back to that teacher researcher idea, which needs are not being met, and maybe that's the answer to this student's disruption. And they also mention, and I love this, and we'll come back to this many times throughout this semester, that for special populations, we need to dig a little deeper in terms of both our understanding of the situation and our response to the situation. They note in chapter 1 that African Americans are the most disproportionately disciplined group. So even though research bears out that that group of students does not behave or misbehave more than any other group, they are more harshly and more frequently disciplined. And again, that's a note for us as people in the classroom, or at least adjacent to the classroom, just to be mindful of and to watch out for as we move forward through the course and in our practice. So this week's readings are transitioning to, again, one of those important components of classroom management that Jones & Jones lay out, which is the importance of positive teacher-student relationships. So reading this week, chapter 3 from Jones & Jones, we'll learn a little bit about different ways to build relationships with students. They introduce this idea from Kleinfeld about warm demanders. So the thinking here is that teachers must, of course, hold high expectations, but should also be nurturing and warm in holding those high expectations. They also bring up the work of Nell Noddings, who's fabulous and has done a lot of really important work on moral education. And she's really forwarded this idea of caring as sort of a goal of moral education. And in this way, so to be a caring educator in Noddings' view, we need to model our expectations. We need to ensure that there is dialogue between students and teachers regularly. We can think about our practice and how caring, the extent to which we are caring practitioners. And students also need some confirmation, and I would say affirmation, of who they are as people and of sort of celebrating their accomplishments. They also raise the question of openness. So as we think about building relationships with our students, we can, the question might arise of how open should we be with students? And they chart 3 different levels of openness from, totally open and sharing absolutely everything, to, just taking sort of a role-based approach and really sharing nothing. And of course, they are advocates of this sort of middle path that they go on to describe. But the bottom line here in this chapter is that we need to care for our students and not just about them. So kind of hand in hand with this reading from chapter 3, I'm also assigned just a brief little article from Robert Marzano. It's a big name in teacher education, in curriculum and instruction as well. And so this is an article called Relating to Students. And I want to kind of note here, it's really brief and it seems really, I think, intuitive. But what's interesting here is that Marzano is actually, he's not looking at, I guess, necessarily strategies that are objectively helpful for building relationships as Jones and Jones are. And by the way, there's so many great suggestions in the Jones and Jones chapter about how to build those relationships. What Marzano is looking at are actions that teachers can take that we know via research positively impact students' perceptions of teacher caring. So again, these are things that from a student perspective demonstrate caring on the part of the teacher. And that's maybe a nuanced distinction, but again, just something helpful to keep in mind. So these are pretty straightforward, showing interest in student lives, and he gives some examples about what that might look like. Advocating for students. He suggests, for instance, if a classroom is set up and the professor, instructor, or teacher says, I'm only going to give 5 A's, that sends the message to students that you don't really care about them, right? That you're more interested in maintaining this grade curve than advocating for students authentically. Never giving up on students. Again, he points out some ways in which that perception is built. And then acting friendly. So notice it's not being friendly, but acting friendly. Again, it's all about the perception within the student view. So again, I think that there are some interesting parallels here, and I hope that you find this reading interesting and enriching. So for this week, remember, if you haven't read the first 2 chapters of our Jones and Jones text, please go back and do that. In addition, make sure that we are also reading chapter 3 from Jones and Jones and that really brief Marzano piece. We also have our very first critical response due, and that's going to be due this Thursday, the initial post this Thursday, the 23rd. And then because there are only 2 of us and 3 including me within this class, please just make sure to follow up with your colleague by Sunday. So that's commenting on their posts and maybe asking questions, maybe offering some affirmations, maybe extending the conversation, sharing experiences, etc. This is how we're going to build collegiality in this online virtual environment. So again, initial post by Thursday and follow up with your colleague by Sunday. For this week, I've given a prompt here that I'd like you to think about when you're drafting your critical response. So the first part asks why, according to our authors, are teacher-student relationships so important? And then secondly, I'm curious about which of their recommended strategies or approaches sound most interesting or most implementable for you in your particular context. Again, so those are the questions that you'll be reflecting on. And these are also noted in our discussion board for critical response number 1 on Blackboard. That is it for this week. Have a lovely week. I hope to see you all back here again soon.